Today we're going to talk about coffee substitutes. Now that might seem a little bit controversial. Why would I, a proponent of coffee, want to talk about the competition? But I think they're interesting. There's something I want to know more about. I've never really tasted a bunch of them. I don't really know too much about them, and this seems like a good excuse to go and learn, taste, and share with you. Now, today's video is going to be split into kind of 3 pieces, kind of escalating nerdery. We're going to taste our way through a bunch of different coffee substitutes, and in the end, actually make one ourselves, kind of from scratch, nearly, but not quite. Here, I have 3 options of instant coffee substitutes. These are essentially something you'd swap out for instant coffee, but they have no coffee in them. We've got the barley cup here, which is barley, rye, and chicory. Very similarly here, we've got blended barley, chicory, and rye drink from Nestle. But then, thankfully, a pure roasted instant chicory drink over here. What we'll do is we'll get a spoon of these into each of the glasses, get some hot water on top, give them a little taste, and talk about why coffee substitutes even exist. Now, you could argue I'm a total idiot for using just off the boil water here, because it's not like I'm extracting any flavour. I could have just done this with 60 degrees Celsius water and then tasted it straight away. I'm not a smart man. There's a couple of reasons why people drink coffee alternatives or substitutes. Firstly, there's a long history of this, and in many cases, things like chicory, for example, were used as coffee substitutes as a kind of adulterant. There'd be 2 reasons to do this. One, you might have limited access to coffee, for example, and we'll talk about that when we talk about chicory properly a little bit later on. Or it could be that you're a fraudster and you're trying to basically bulk out coffee, which costs more, with something cheap like chicory again, just to bulk the product out to make more money selling fraudulent coffee. Rarely, historically, was this a straight swap. In more modern times, food adulteration is less of a concern specifically within coffee, and people are often drinking these because they don't want caffeine. They might want that kind of roasty, rich heaviness that comes from coffee without the caffeine. And I know decaf is a great alternative, and I have a fantastic decaf project and video planned for next year, but that's not right now. I don't know, this is not something that historically I've experienced a great deal, so I'm kind of super curious to try these. Am I nervous? That is nothing like coffee to me. That is slightly herbaceous, it's quite woody, it is quite bitter. It's got a sweetness to it that's kind of off-putting. It's not sweet, but it's definitely got some sweetness there, which makes sense considering the ingredients in there. This is basically the same thing as that, so let's see if Nestle can make it any better. Ooh. No. So far, coffee is very secure as my beverage of choice. This one I would say has more chicory taste than this one. It's quite sort of herbal and slightly medicinal, and then a little bit more bitter as well. Let's try the pure chicory down the end though. Weirdly sweet. That chicory flavour is extremely herbaceous and kind of odd and unusual. I don't think I know anything that tastes like this. I couldn't say it tastes like X. You know what I mean? It's quite hard to pull that out. It's got that kind of almost like coriander seed, herbally oddness to it. This is just level 1. Things can be escalated here. And that's what we're going to do. We're not going to use instant substitutes anymore. We're going to use some pre-ground substitutes that you can straight swap for coffee. And we'll brew a few V60s of coffee substitutes. Now, first up, this one I'm super curious about. It's made of peanuts. It's brand new, it's a whole new thing. It is 100% peanut coffee. This was invented by this particular company, is a peanut farmer, and I have no idea how this is going to taste. So this is like made in the US. He did actually have to help out because they don't ship to the UK, so I appreciate him helping out getting this to us. Oh, okay. Now this smells like dark roasted coffee. It's got a lot of that deep roasting smell to it. There's a little bit of nuttiness in there, but it's not overtly peanut. I am super intrigued by you. So we're going to brew this like coffee. After that, I'm going to brew this, which is an acorn coffee. Now, in this particular case, and the reason I'm brewing it second, is that it does have some spices mixed into here. It's 98.5% acorn, the rest is spice. So I don't want to have too much cross-contamination going on. And while I'm doing those, I have this one, which is dandelion root. This one says take 1 to 2 teaspoons and infuse it for 3 to 10 minutes, depending on your strength preferences. But it is marketed as dandelion coffee, so I guess let's make it. I'll do a steep and release brew of this in the switch. I'll brew it for maybe 10 minutes and see what we get. No, it's sesame oil I'm thinking of. It's got a sesame quality and a peanut quality to it as well. Because peanuts are very fatty, so you've got to find a way to get the fat out, and I guess you take the remaining solubles and then roast them. And then there's enough protein and other stuff there, and sugars, I guess, in the peanut to go brown and be soluble. It's interesting. You smell very herbal, like very herbal. I don't see much CO2, so there doesn't seem to be a lot of point in letting this bloom. It's got like a little bit of an oxidized quality to it. And it really does remind me more of dark roasted coffee than it does of peanuts at this point. While that's draining out, let's steep some dandelion roots for a little while. I don't think we're going to get a lot in the way of colour out of this. Now, it could be that traditionally you might have roasted these roots. I'm not going to roast these ones. We're going to roast some chicory in a little bit, but for now I'll let that steep. It really looks, and I suspect will taste more like tea. Colour-wise, that peanut coffee looks like coffee. It looks a tiny bit weak compared to coffee, but it looks like coffee. That is clove, my enemy. Cardamom, ginger, and cinnamon. But I mostly smell the cloves. That's very finely ground powder, so I'm kind of curious how this will brew. Oh, it's like mud. I will confess that I'm not doing this as the instructions say, because I don't like bits of stuff in my drink. The way they want you to do this is to kind of boil it all up together and then serve it in the cup with the bits still in it, which is why it's so finely ground. I can't do the bits like this. So we're going to strain it, and our brew will probably take a while. And while this drips out, I would say that this is probably finished steeping, though it doesn't look like it's taken a lot of colour. So again, we've got like a coffee-like liquid. Again, doesn't look particularly strong, but you know, this is not a viable coffee substitute because it's not a brown liquid, and I feel like that's the qualifying, requirement to be a coffee alternative, is to look like coffee. We'll have a little taste of you in a second. I did try a dandelion substitute, which was an instant one, and it just tasted of kind of brown. So this is interesting to taste in comparison. And so first up is our peanut coffee. It looks like a cup of coffee. I'm kind of intrigued. This smells kind of sesame, peanut, barbecue coffee. It feels a bit weak. So I'll say if you were going to try this, if you're curious about it, I would dose more than 65 grams a litre. I'd probably be like 80 grams a litre, something like that. It's a little bit roasty for me. It's a little bit there's a bit of that kind of harsher roasty edge where bitterness is coming to the forefront. Again, if it was dosed up a bit and had a splash of milk, cream, or dairy alternatives, something like that in there, it could be quite coffee-like. It's kind of interesting. It's got some texture. It is quite nutty, unsurprisingly. Of the drinks we've tasted, it has the most overlap with coffee so far. Kind of, probably. But it's a different drink to me. It's a different drink. It's a little weak, and I wish it was a little lighter roasted. Let's move on to the acorn coffee. Again, looks like coffee. You know what I mean? I would expect this to taste like coffee. It smells very spiced. Okay, that's kind of weird and interesting. Very spice dominant, and then you're trying to pick out what isn't spice in there. Like what is the flavor coming from the acorns? If it wasn't spiced, it would just taste like the color brown. It's not particularly bitter, which is interesting. This has obviously not been roasted on the end here. This is just the dandelion root, but I'm intrigued to taste it, having had the roasted instant beverage at some point, because it was a bit like the acorn. It just had nothing but sort of brown. This smells more like gentian root. It smells quite herbaceous. You might find it in an amaro. Is it bitter though? Yes. If you really like amaros, that kind of sort of herbal, complex, sweet booze, sweetening this up would get you close to that kind of experience without the alcohol. And I definitely preferred the instant version. If you were going to drink dandelion root in some regard, probably get it, roast it, grind it, brew it that way. But if I was going to roast and grind anything, it would be chicory, the #1 coffee substitute. It is the most famous. It has the longest history entwined with coffee. Coffee and chicory are still available today in a bunch of different places. And so in a second, well, that's what I'm going to do. But I've got a couple of things to deal with first. This is a sponsored video, which means there is a coffee grinder giveaway. Every sponsored video, I give away 5 Baratza Encores. If you are down on your luck, if life is hard, if you've been laid off, if times are tough, and a coffee grinder would make your life better, enter down below. It's free to enter, just click down below. You just have to be in one of the 39 countries that we can ship to and warranty the grinder in afterwards. If you can afford a grinder right now, please go and support a local business. Now, more than ever, they need your help and support. And this is possible because this video is sponsored by Squarespace. If you need a website or a domain, then I would recommend checking out Squarespace. Squarespace is an incredible platform that lets you take your images, your words, your ideas, take one of their templates and mix them together into a beautiful website that is so quick and so easy to build. And more than that, it'll look great on every single browser, every single device. That's all taken care of. Beyond that, there's nothing even to patch, upgrade, or install. But don't take my word for it. Whether you're going to build a website for your cafe or a little e-commerce side hustle, go and sign up for a free trial. And after 14 days, when you're ready to launch, use code James Hoffmann for 10% off any website or any domain. Thanks to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. Let's talk about the kind of main coffee substitute that exists in the world, and that is chicory. Here we're talking root chicory specifically. And you can dig it out of the ground, dehydrate it, and that's basically what this is. It's dehydrated pieces of root, and then you can roast it. And that's exactly what I did. Now, I've roasted coffee in my life, and I wouldn't say I'm a coffee roaster, but I do know a little bit about coffee roasting, and I wondered if there was anything that I could maybe apply to roasting my own chicory, because there needs to be some development of flavor in that roasting process, but I was kind of curious how it would work. So I ran a very simple experiment, mirroring a fun experiment to do if you're roasting coffee. Now here, I didn't use a coffee roaster or anything like that. I just used an oven, which is a flawed way to roast things, I'm aware. I wouldn't necessarily recommend roasting coffee in your oven, so already I'm not learning some key lessons. I took about 100 grams of chicory root, spread it out on a baking sheet and roasted it at 180 degrees for about 30 minutes. That number I did not come to by accident. I did a previous test. Every 5 minutes or so, I would take it out, give it a stir, and then pull out a little sample to then grind down and brew and see how the flavors were developing. And here, after about 30 minutes, I felt there was a really nice balance between developing flavor and developing a little bit too much bitterness. Now, some bitterness is inevitable with this. It's bitter to begin with, but you can sort of mitigate that by not roasting too dark. Now, as part of the research on this, I did dig into the archives, and Google Books is brilliant for this, and I'll link to it down below. And I found a book from 1864 called Coffee and Chicory. And this was a super interesting little read on the chicory section anyway. It let me know some useful things like the kind of roast loss that was historically used for chicory. So they would typically be roasting it until they'd lost 25 to 30% of the weight. In this case, I checked the roast loss, and for me, it was unsurprisingly a little bit less than that. It was about 22% roast loss in this particular process. And some of that's going to be water, some of that's going to be other stuff coming out of there. But again, I don't know how dry their chicory was to start with back in the day. They talked about kind of kiln drying it. This is just, I think, straight dehydrated, but interesting nonetheless. Actually interesting in that book was talking about how as chicory became more valuable as a coffee substitute, you know, people began to adulterate chicory with other things, which I just thought was kind of hilarious that, you know, people are adulterating coffee with chicory, but maybe there's a cheaper way to do that. And you can adulterate your chicory with grains, or in some cases, coffee husks, which I thought was fascinating. So that's how we started. We started with some chicory root, and then we roasted it. Let's see what we've got now. So I'll shake a bit of the unroasted out onto the table here, and I'll compare it to what we've got going on here. I'm going to brew some of this up. I'm going to brew a V60 as before. I feel quite sorry for this Comandante grinder. It's pretty new, but it's doing, you know, chicory tests, as well as, I think the last thing it ground that was coffee from the 1950s. If you didn't see that, it's up here. Oh, that's really interesting. 20 grams of chicory. Now, as I'm brewing this, it feels reasonably important to point out that, again, this was not meant to really be drunk on its own. This was an adulterant. This was something you blended in with your coffee. And historically it was done to sort of stretch coffee supplies. There are 2 very famous instances of chicory being used as a coffee substitute. The first is in the Napoleonic Wars, when France could no longer access its coffee growing colonies, but had to then sort of stretch its coffee supplies out, and they used chicory for that. The other example is from New Orleans, where in the American Civil War, it was blockaded again, and that was a key port for coffee, and so coffee supplies had to be stretched out. And again, they used chicory. Now in the UK, we have camp coffee, which is a sort of coffee and chicory extract that people use in baking and that kind of stuff. It's not really for me, but it is a very traditional taste for many people. It's just unusual to drink pure chicory. Now the color on this is so interesting. Look how dark that liquid looks. Now the grounds didn't look that dark. If you compare sort of coffee, that looked like a kind of light to medium roast in terms of grounds color, but the liquid below looks like a deep dark roast. Now again, I suspect they were roasting it a bit darker than I am today, not just because that book contains a kind of chemical breakdown. It's maybe not the most accurate. I don't really know what gummy matter is, but if it's like 4 to 5% ash, you're probably roasting it a bit darker than I am. Look at that. It's like molasses. That's a very dark liquid. Maybe I brewed this too strong. It's got a kind of molassesy smell, like a burnt sugar, but emphasis on the burnt. I don't like it, but I kind of get it. It's intensely bitter. It is like a kind of bitter leaf, like a bitter salad leaf bitterness, that interesting kind of bite that you get. Really interesting. No acidity, tons of texture. This is extremely soluble. And actually, again, back to that book, they were saying yields of like 45 to 60% soluble material. So you could probably use a little bit less. And again, if you're trying to stretch stuff out, very useful for that. I don't want this in my life. I don't want to drink it, but I understand someone might enjoy this, actually. Though probably brewed a bit weaker. It's such an attack. It's such a pure expression of bitterness to me. I don't like this. I don't want to drink it ever again. But I've really enjoyed roasting it up, grinding it down, and brewing it. And I can totally see how people still enjoy a little chicory in their coffee. It's just not for me. I'm too, I guess, in love with what coffee is and can do and all of that kind of stuff. But that is a little bit of fun. Now, I'm curious, what did I leave out? I am aware I should have probably included Caffè d'Orzo, a grain-based, sort of barley-based espresso alternative common in Italy and in some parts of Spain and Portugal too. I didn't get hold of any of that in good time, but I'm aware that exists. But do you like coffee substitutes? Did you learn something today? What surprised you about all this, or was it all exactly as you thought it would be? I would love to hear from you down in the comments below, but for now I say thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great day.